Think about the voices shaping how we see the world, especially, science. We tend to look up to certain figures.
Right, as reliable guides.
Exactly. But what if the info they share, well, isn't quite right? Can we really just take everything at face value, even from science communicators we admire?
That's really the core question for today, isn't it? I
Yeah.
mean, with so much information out there, accuracy from public figures, especially in science, feels more crucial than ever.
It really does. And that brings us to our deep dive today, looking closely at the public statements of Neil deGrasse Tyson. He's obviously huge in popularizing science.
Hugely influential, yeah.
But the sources we've gone through, they've raised some, well, pretty serious questions about factual accuracy and maybe some misrepresentation in his work.
And just to be clear, our aim here isn't like a general attack. It's a focused look at specific instances based purely on our source material where what he said has been challenged.
Right. We'll unpack these things, and as we go, we'll define some key terms, too, which should help clarify the discussion points.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, let's jump in. So one of the first things that popped up in the sources was about statistical accuracy.
Oh, yes.
Apparently, in a lecture where he was trying to clear up data misconceptions, Tyson might have actually mixed up average and median. For someone teaching data literacy, that sounds like a bit of a fundamental slip-up.
It is, really. Average or mean and median, they're different ways to describe the center of data. They tell you different things. They react differently to extreme values.
Okay.
So using them interchangeably, especially when you're trying to teach clarity, it kind of undermines the whole effort. It's maybe a lack of precision there.
Right. So the very thing he aimed to correct, he might have muddied further. That does raise a bit of a flag, doesn't it?
It does.
Okay, moving on. The sources also point to cases of misattributed quotes. One example given was, "Our country is addicted to oil." Apparently that was wrongly pinned on George W. Bush.
Yeah, the material we reviewed indicates Bush didn't say that. And that brings us to our first term, a misattributed quote.
Okay.
It's simply when you credit a statement to the wrong person. Even if the quote sounds like something they might say, getting the attribution right is, well, basic factual honesty.
And when public figures get it wrong,
It just spreads misinformation, doesn't it? Blurs the lines between what was actually said and what people think was said.
yeah, it kind of rewrites history in small ways. There was another one mentioned, too, involving Representative Maxine Waters.
Yes, the sources indicate Tyson also misquoted Representative Waters about her views on congressional priorities. Again, maybe the exact wording isn't the point, but the principle is.
The principle of accuracy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Especially for someone seen as an authority, it points to maybe a certain carelessness with the details.
Okay, so beyond direct misquotes, the sources talk about something they call embellished stories.
Right.
The example was an anecdote about jury duty where apparently the details kind of shifted in different tellings. What's the issue there?
Well, an embellished story, let's define that, is basically a narrative where details get tweaked or added, maybe to make it punchier or more memorable.
Okay.
And look, storytelling is great for science communication. Anecdotes make things relatable. But if you start changing the actual facts within the story...
It erodes trust.
Precisely. If small details change, you start wondering about the bigger claims, is everything getting the same treatment?
Yeah, it makes you question the overall commitment to just stating the facts as they are. Okay, next area. Historical misrepresentation. This feels important, especially when science intersects with history and culture.
Definitely.
The focus here was on the decline of Islamic science. What's the claim Tyson apparently made, and what's the pushback?
So Tyson has been criticized for presenting a rather simplified and reportedly inaccurate story blaming the scholar al-Ghazali, who lived around the 12th century, for basically killing off scientific progress in the Muslim world.
Blaming his theological views.
Yes, suggesting they stifled inquiry. But historians see this as a historical misrepresentation. The scholarship actually shows quite vibrant scientific activity, continuing long after al-Ghazali.
Oh, really? Like who?
Figures like Ibn Sina, al-Biruni, major advancements were still happening. This idea of blaming al-Ghazali, it often gets tied into something called the warfare thesis.
Okay, warfare thesis. We should probably define that one.
Good idea. The warfare thesis is this largely outdated and discredited view that science and religion have always been locked in this fundamental conflict.
The science versus religion narrative.
Exactly. Modern history shows it's way more complex periods of tension, sure, but also collaboration and mutual influence, not just constant war.
Got it. So important to spot those overly simple historical narratives. Now let's shift to scientific consensus, specifically around climate change.
Right.
Our sources say Tyson correctly stresses human-caused climate change, which is obviously crucial, but what's the criticism about how it's sometimes presented?
Well, the scientific consensus on humans driving climate change is incredibly strong, no doubt about that. The criticism reported in our sources is more about how the outputs of climate models are sometimes discussed.
How so?
These models are super complex, right? Lots of variables, feedback loops. There are still uncertainties, especially about precise regional impacts or exact timelines for things.
Sure, that makes sense.
The critique is that sometimes Tyson might present these model projections almost as settled facts without fully highlighting the inherent uncertainties that are just, part of cutting-edge science.
So the core message is right, but maybe the nuances around the projections get lost sometimes.
That seems to be the concern raised, yeah. Reflecting the ongoing refinement is also part of accurate communication.
Okay. Next up, errors in science communication, specifically what the sources call astrophysical oversimplifications. What kind of examples did they give?
One key example is the Big Bang. It's our leading model, absolutely. But it's sometimes presented, like in Cosmos, as the definitive beginning, kind of glossing over big open questions.
Like what came before?
Well,
Or multiverses?
Exactly. Things science is still grappling with. Presenting it as totally solved is an astrophysical oversimplification. Another example mentioned was the Hubble constant, the universe's expansion rate. Early disputes about its value weren't just measurement errors. They involved different underlying assumptions, some rooted in methodological naturalism. Tyson's accounts, reportedly, sometimes skip that complexity.
Okay, you mentioned methodological naturalism. We should define that, as it sounds important.
Yes, methodological naturalism is basically a ground rule for doing science. It says that scientific explanation should only refer to natural causes and processes. You don't invoke the supernatural or divine when you're trying to explain observations scientifically. It's about the method of science.
Got it. It's how science operates, not necessarily a statement about ultimate reality itself. Which leads nicely into the next point. The sources talk about a potential conflation of methodological and philosophical naturalism. What's the difference and what's the issue?
This is a subtle but really key distinction. Philosophical naturalism goes further than the methodological kind. It's a worldview, a belief that only natural things exist, no supernatural realm, period.
Okay, so one's a tool for science, the other's a belief system.
Pretty much. The issue raised in the sources is that Tyson sometimes seems to dismiss philosophy as, useless for science.
Right, I've heard comments like that.
While at the same time, his own arguments often seem grounded in an unexamined philosophical naturalism. He treats the scientific method as if it automatically proves the broader philosophical conclusion. That blending or conflation can mask underlying assumptions.
So, by sidelining philosophy, he might be ignoring the philosophical roots of his own stance. Is there an example?
Well, think about it. He argues passionately for science, reason, evidence. These are values, right? Valuing truth, logic, honesty. These are fundamentally philosophical commitments.
Good point.
So dismissing philosophy while heavily relying on philosophical concepts to make his case, it creates a kind of tension, maybe an unacknowledged bias.
Using the tools without acknowledging the toolbox, maybe? Okay, this next point sounds quite pointed. Bending facts for secular narratives. What does that mean, and what examples are given?
A secular narrative in this context would be like a story that emphasizes non-religious factors and perhaps downplays or critiques religious influence. The key example cited is Giordano Bruno.
The monk burned at the stake. Often portrayed as a martyr for science, right? For supporting Copernicus.
Exactly. And that's how Cosmos presented him. But historians point out that while Bruno had some interesting cosmological ideas, the main reason for his execution were serious theological heresies, things that challenged core Catholic doctrine at the time.
So not primarily about astronomy.
Apparently not. So presenting him purely as a science martyr fits a neat science versus religion story, a secular narrative, but it seems to require simplifying or misrepresenting the actual historical reasons.
Were there other examples?
The sources also mention a specific claim Tyson made about the percentage of religious believers in the National Academy of Sciences, which was apparently disputed as inaccurate.
Okay, so shaping facts to fit a preferred storyline. This connects to the next point. What the sources call atheist rhetoric under an agnostic label. Tyson identifies as agnostic.
Yes, agnosticism being the view that God's existence is unknown or unknowable.
Right, but the claim is his language often sounds more like atheism.
Atheism being the lack of belief or disbelief in God. The sources point out that while he uses the agnostic label, his rhetoric often involves sharp criticism or even mockery of religious beliefs, comparing religious stories to fairy tales, for instance.
Okay.
And he frequently asserts that science and religion are fundamentally incompatible.
Which contrasts with?
Well, with the experiences of many scientists, past and present, like Francis Collins, former head of the NIH, who are people of faith and see harmony between their science and their beliefs.
So there's a perceived mismatch between the label "I don't know" and the rhetoric "religion is wrong, silly."
That seems to be the criticism, yes. Which leads into the idea of scientific dogmatism.
Interesting. Usually dogmatism is aimed at religion.
Right. But scientific dogmatism is about treating scientific conclusions as absolute, unquestionable truths, maybe ignoring the provisional nature of science.
How does this apply here?
Well, Tyson often critiques religious dogmatism, rightly pointing out issues with blind faith. But then, some critics argue, he exhibits a similar certainty about science with statements like, science is true whether or not you believe in it. While science aims for objective truth, our understanding is always evolving. Presenting current consensus as immutable dogma can be seen as, well, dogmatic in its own way. The sources also mention him dismissing critiques of things like evolutionary psychology as simply unscientific without perhaps engaging with the methodological points being raised.
It's about maintaining that critical lens even towards science itself. Okay, the sources also revisit presenting contested theories as settled, mentioning the Big Bang again, but also the Savannah hypothesis. What's that?
Right, we touched on the Big Bang's nuances. The Savannah hypothesis is an idea in paleoanthropology suggesting key human traits like walking upright evolved because our ancestors moved onto open grasslands.
Okay.
Cosmos, apparently, presented this quite definitively, but in the field itself, it's still debated. There are competing ideas, maybe woodlands or even aquatic environments played key roles.
Yeah.
Fossil evidence is complex.
So presenting one contested theory as the answer is misleading.
That's the argument, yeah. It doesn't reflect the active debate and uncertainty within the science itself.
Okay, almost there. We also have ethical concerns raised in the sources. What were they?
Two main things were mentioned. One was a partnership with NatureBox, a snack company, promoted on his Star Talk show, where some of the health claims made about the snacks were reportedly misleading.
Commercial interests potentially blurring scientific communication.
That's the implication. Yeah. The other, much more serious point, involved multiple allegations of sexual misconduct against Tyson, which led to investigations by Fox and National Geographic.
Right, those were widely reported.
The sources note the contrast between these serious allegations and his public persona as an educator and role model.
A significant ethical dimension indeed. Then there's cherry-picking data and oversimplification again.
Yeah, a revisit. One example given is crediting the Enlightenment's progress almost solely to secularism, while maybe downplaying the contributions of deeply religious scientists like Newton or Mendel. That's potentially cherry-picking data, selecting facts that support one narrative while ignoring others.
And climate science was mentioned again here too.
Just briefly, as another example where simplification might sometimes gloss over important complexities, as we discussed earlier.
Okay. And finally, we circle back to dismissing philosophy while using its ideas. The God of the Gaps critique.
Right. Tyson often criticizes the God of the Gaps argument. That's where people invoke God to explain things science hasn't figured out yet.
Like, we don't know how life started, so God must have done it.
Exactly. But the critique of that argument itself often relies on philosophical ideas about what counts as a good explanation, about epistemic humility, about the likely progress of science. It assumes a philosophical framework.
And this relates to scientism.
Yes, scientism, we should define that, is the belief that science is the only path to real knowledge, and that it can, in principle, answer all meaningful questions.
The idea that if science can't answer it, it's not worth asking or it's unknowable.
Precisely. And that itself is a philosophical position, not a scientific finding. So dismissing philosophy while championing scientism is seen as somewhat contradictory.
Wow, okay. We've covered a lot of ground there. Quite a range of issues flagged in the source concerning Neil deGrasse Tyson's public work.
We really have, from basic stats and quotes through historical accounts, how science itself is presented, the role of philosophy, potential biases, even ethical questions.
So just to recap the aim here, this was about critically examining the specific points raised in the materials we reviewed regarding his statements.
Exactly. Laying out the concerns as reported.
So maybe a final thought for you, our listener, to consider as you process all this. What is the responsibility that comes with being such a prominent voice for science?
Yeah, and what's the potential impact on public trust, on understanding complex issues when inaccuracies or particular narratives take hold?
It really encourages us all, doesn't it, to keep our critical thinking sharp, even when listening to figures we respect and admire. That's definitely something to mull over.